Welcome to this podcast. I have with me Professor Dietrich Vollrath, who is chair of the Department of Economics at the University of Houston in Texas. Professor Vollrath has written extensively on the structural changes that underpin the growth process, including the role played by land ownership, the process of urbanization, and the role played by education institutions. Professor Vollrath's recent book is titled Fully Grown: Why a Stagnant Economy is a Sign of Success. This was awarded Books of the Year in 2020 by The Economist. Professor Vollrath currently serves as the Associate Editor for the Journal of Development Economics and co-editor of Economic Inquiry. Professor Vollrath obtained his master's and PhD from Brown University after obtaining a BA from University of Michigan. Professor has authored over 17 articles in referred journals, including the Journal of Economic Growth, World Development, Journal of Development Economics, American Economic Journal, Journal of Money, Credit, and Banking. Yeah, welcome to this podcast, Professor Vollrath.
Great, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for coming on the show. So,
Sure.
Professor, I kind of start off by asking you some personal questions in terms of where you were raised, in the US, and then what was the motivation of going on to pursue a PhD in economics. And I will also like you to talk about one economist in particular that left an indelible impression on you as you began your professional career.
Yeah, thanks. So I grew up in the Midwest in the United States in Wisconsin. For anyone who has a little sense of the geography, north of Chicago, so gonna drive north of Chicago a few hours. Uh, I grew up on a dairy farm raising cows. So that's kind of my background. I Once I got back to grad school and started studying economic growth and stuff, I've done a lot of work on agriculture, which I didn't quite. I tried very hard to get away from that when I was a kid, when I went to school, but it seemed to kind of creep back in. I guess it was built into what I was going to do. Yeah, I think you were asking, about like kind of how I ended up getting
Yeah.
to economics.
Yeah.
I started college as an engineer, and just didn't find that kind of what, kind of you kind of did 1 year of school and you kind of looked at the classes you're going to take and kind of going forward. And in engineering, it's very structured, and I just wasn't very excited about the classes, or if I was, they were the ones that were 3 years away, and
Okay.
I impatient, and I had to do social science credits, and I
Okay.
was taking some economics, and that was just, the topics were just, to me, much more exciting, and I could kind of think and study about them right away, and that sent me that direction. So I did that. I worked for a little while in the private sector, and then ended up back in graduate school, as I tell people, because I realized I didn't like having a real job.
Yeah.
I wanted to be in academia, and so I ended up at Brown,
Yeah.
where I got to study with a bunch of amazing. One of the reasons I chose Brown was I thought economic growth was just kind of fascinating as just a broad topic. And at Brown, I got to study with Oded Galor and David Weil. Peter Howlett was still there. So I got kind of this thrown right into the deep pool of economic growth, and the endogenous growth theory was in the middle of its kind of, I don't know, kind of its explosion at that
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
Starting to do more empirical and historical work.
Yes.
Yeah, so it was a great place to be, and it definitely formed kind of a lot of the trajectory that I ended up on. And you asked about kind of favorite economist.
Yeah.
Oded Galor and David Weil were two of my advisors, who were just kind of fundamental to the way I think. But one of my favorites was getting exposed to Chad Jones, who I've been fortunate enough to work with a little on a textbook, because the way so the way he thinks about how the process of growth works is kind of how I've absorbed that. It makes sense to me, and part of the reason is because I think the way he explains logic and economic intuition of things is just brilliant. And so he's always been someone I've kind of tried to model my own writing or speaking after, because I think it's not a common skill, and he's very adept at it. So yeah, he's kind of always in that voice, I think, in the back of my head is how would he explain things?
Yeah. You can pick one more economist, sir.
Oh, I
I,
can't. Okay,
yeah,
cool.
yeah,
Oh no.
yeah.
I hmm. Well, I won't pick. Well, if I had knew I had two, I probably just would have said Oded and David, so they didn't get mad. No, and the other one I think is similar in the line of thinking about people who I just think of as fundamentally influential would be Paul Romer,
Yeah.
for kind of for obvious reasons about kind of originating endogenous growth theory,
Yes.
but also, and I think kind of more importantly, though, again, the way he is able to intuit and explain the core ideas of
Yes.
that,
Yes.
as opposed to do the math,
Yes.
is just crucially important. And so I've always admired him for that. And it's somebody else whose stuff I kind of go back to every now and then. And
Yeah.
just you can kind of mine Paul Romer's early writings on economic growth for ideas
Yeah.
over and over again. Yeah.
Yeah. So that sort of, Professor, brings me to the next question,
Mm-hmm.
which is linked to your book, Fully Grown, Why a Stagnant Economy is a Sign of Success.
Yeah.
So, Professor, why don't you tell us what was, the motivation, behind this book, and
Yeah.
what was the sort of insight and the underlying message as to why a stagnant
Yeah.
economy, where the growth rate is less, is a sign of success? And we are referring here mainly to the advanced Western
Right.
countries.
Right. And so this is very much, and so that's an important kind of distinction is the book's very much written using data from the US and about the US.
Yeah,
And but I think it's applicable to a lot of advanced Western countries. It's not a claim or a story that I would apply to a developing country
yeah, yeah,
like India, like that, then a period of very slow growth would not be something that I would look at and say,
yeah,
hey, we're doing everything correct. So this
yes,
is very much a story about rich countries, and that's really ultimately the story of why you would call it a sign of success. It's these countries have reached the point where they're wealthy enough to if you like, they were wealthy enough to make kind of choices that didn't necessarily lead to rapid growth because they
uh-huh,
had the comfort of having the material goods and the kind of standard of living that they could enable those choices. That's kind of maybe the big way to think about it. I wrote it mainly just interested in, well, why was growth slowing down in the US? Kind of
hmm,
across rich countries, it's been relatively slow for the last
yeah,
20 years.
yeah,
And I wanted to, I came into it thinking I was going to write a book about why things like market power and industrial concentration and giant firms charging big markups were slowing down the economy. And there's little, those things aren't aren't false. Like they do have an effect on the growth rate, but kind of as I did the background work, I
uh-huh,
realized most of the growth slowdown in the US is really driven by things like changes in demographics.
yeah,
So the 20th century, the US had a big surge of working age people, and
yeah,
then that really fell off. So you kind of I think time in developing countries, you often hear like South Korea had a demographic dividend, Taiwan had a demographic dividend,
okay,
China essentially did, but the US had a big one too in the 20th century because of the baby boom. And as that has kind of as those people have aged out of the workforce, we've gotten slower growth. And then the other one is the shift from producing mainly goods to producing mainly services, and that
yes,
just had
yes,
consequences for productivity growth. So those were the two big drivers of the
yes,
slowdown. And when you look at them, they both are really the outcomes of things going well. So
yes,
the baby boom after World War II in the US was a huge surge in fertility,
yes,
and there are various reasons that people talk about it, but the important part is that it was followed up by a collapse in fertility.
okay,
Really, that generation of people, there was a lot of baby boom people born in the late 40s,
yes,
1950s, 1960s, and they just didn't have kids at a very high rate.
yes,
Uh, and why didn't they have kids at a very high rate? Well, it's the introduction of the birth control pill. It's
uh-huh,
the expansion of women's ability to enter the workforce and different
mm-hmm,
professions. So what happens, you see a lot of family formation getting delayed, women going to school more, starting more lengthier careers before they
mm-hmm,
start families. And so these are all good things, right? These are all
yeah,
the expansion of women's ability to participate in the economy and take control of their own families
Yeah.
is unequivocally a good thing. It
Yes.
happened to have a consequence that
Yes.
down a few decades later, there was this dip and therefore not kind of a
Yes.
follow-up generation of workers that was as big, and we're kind of living
Yes.
with that.
Yes.
So in that sense, it was always this growth slowdown is a big part of it. It's just
Yes.
an unintended consequence of a big
Yes.
success in
Yes.
that. And then the shift from goods to services is
Yeah.
similar, and every country goes through this. This is universal. We see in the
Yes.
data that as you get richer, you
Yeah.
shift into buying more and more services from one another, and buying fewer, not buying fewer things. We have more, the US is materially very wealthy.
Yes.
We have lots of
Yes.
goods.
Yes.
But on the margin, as we expand our income, larger and larger percentages of that go to things that we do for one another as opposed to
Yes.
things we make for one another. And stuff we do for one another, services, teaching, this podcast,
Yeah. Yeah.
advertising, legal services, finance, all that stuff, it tends to have relatively slow productivity growth
Yeah.
uh, for lots of interesting reasons, which are probably, I could talk for hours about that.
Yeah.
But but that's also just another sign of success. It's just we're wealthy. It's
Yes.
easy for us. It was cheap for us to make refrigerators and cars
Yeah.
and homes and all these things. And so we moved on to making things that were just kind of not as high productivity because we
Yes.
didn't need, yeah.
Yeah.
And so those things are all at work in these rich countries like the US. And so that slow growth is not really a sign that things went wrong. It's just that
Yeah.
we've kind of reached we've become just very well off. And so
Yeah.
this was maybe in some sense inevitable.
Yeah.
And there's definitely tweaks that one, could raise the growth rate with,
Yeah.
but in some sense, this is something that any country that approaches that frontier is
Yes.
going to
Yes.
experience, right?
Yeah.
So South Korea is going through this now.
Yes.
Their growth rate's starting to slow down. And why? Well, in
Yeah.
large part because their demographics have changed and because they
Yes.
got rich.
Yes.
It's just hard to grow really fast. You can't grow at kind of say like 1990s Chinese or early 2000s
Yeah.
Chinese rates. You
Yeah.
can't grow like that for a long
Yeah.
time, right? India is
Yes.
just beginning
Japan is
kind of
also a clear case where the
yeah,
population decline has,
exactly, right?
yeah.
Like it's anybody who you kind of get rich, you're going to slow down.
Yeah.
So, but it's not a bad thing. It just means you've kind of reached close
Yeah.
to the front.
So one
Yeah.
hypothetical question which I have is that do you think that the definition of growth as the way, we tend to measure it, needs, changing in terms of, how you measure
So,
it from a
yeah.
market economy perspective
No,
versus,
okay, so I think the answer is no. Growth is what it is, right? So to use the British term, GDP growth does what it says on the tin. Like it's the measure of the growth of the value of goods and services produced.
Mhm, mhm.
It's fine. It's exactly what you want it to measure, and
Yeah,
that growth rate happens to slow down.
yeah,
But there's lots of other things to life, right? And there's
yeah,
lots of other avenues that we care about. We clearly do because we make choices
yeah,
that move away from economic growth, but move towards things like environmental quality, right?
yeah,
So across
yes,
the Western world, we're
yes,
making lots of choices that are not ones that maybe necessarily lead to rapid GDP growth, but do
yes,
lead to lower resource use.
yes,
Great. That's awesome. It's just a different metric. We don't need to, I think it's incorrect to think that we should add things into GDP or modify how we calculate GDP.
yeah,
We should measure other things too. Like we don't need one number, right?
yeah,
So like let's let GDP be GDP.
yeah,
It measures something very clearly and very well.
yeah,
But if you tell me you want to look at some other measure of, say, environmental consequences, or
yeah,
if you just are interested in things like what's the percentage of people who have access to basic health care or are
yeah,
able to finish secondary school, or the proportion of women who are, kind of the relative achievement of women and men in, say, schooling or something.
yeah,
This is a
yeah,
metric that you think is important. Okay, cool. Let's look at that.
yeah,
We don't need to try and find a way to calculate it along with GDP. Just there's lots of numbers that we care about.
yes,
Um, yeah. So I think growth is measured the way it should be measured, and it's great.
yes.
if it slows down, okay, there may be other things that we're looking at that are going up, so to speak,
Yes.
and that's but I don't think we need to change how we measure it.
Yes. So I was listening to one of, your podcast, and you sort of made a reference to, the services. And so there are other services which tend to actually have no impact on society. For example, you gave the reference of porn industry in one of your podcasts. Yeah, I
Yeah,
remember.
yeah.
So I was talking from that perspective also. Like, do we need to be cautious in terms of, what kind of services are, adding value?
Well, and that's been a long running question about GDP, right? It measures every transaction. I mean, to the extent that we can capture the data, it measures all the transactions that we do.
Yeah,
Uh, but if I go out and buy beer
yeah,
and a porno magazine
yeah,
for $30, then that's $30 of that economic activity, the same as if I go out and buy diapers and
yeah,
formula for
yeah, yeah,
baby.
yeah, yeah,
And that's I mean, I certainly may have moral feelings about that, but GDP is just GDP.
yeah,
We don't, I think sometimes we load moral weight onto, oh, the economy grew, so things must be, quote, getting better. Like,
yeah,
no, we need more goods and services,
yeah,
period. It
yeah,
doesn't, and usually on average, that kind of sort of is associated with things being, quote, better on a lot
yes,
of dimensions. But
yeah,
but if you worry about kind of the moral content of what we produce, then you
yes,
have to look at what we produce and decide, I wish we didn't produce as much porn. I wish
yeah,
we produced diapers. Okay,
yeah,
well, then maybe we should have a policy to tax porn and
yeah,
subsidize diapers. But
yeah,
we can't just look at the growth rate. You can't
yeah,
just look at the growth rate and know that, right?
yeah,
There's no moral quality to it.
yes,
There's no extra weight to
yes,
something that's quote, good and less weight to something that's bad. If it sells for $10, it sells for $10.
yes, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, we now, Professor, come to the, the breakdown of human capital,
Yeah.
which is one of the key drivers of, growth.
Yeah.
And so one of your thesis is that growth slowdown has in the US, it had a lot to do with population aging, such as declining fertility and,
Yeah.
the change in the age distribution.
Yeah.
And so human capital, actually, if you break it down, it's a aggregation of education, which is a reflection of the number of years and presumably, reflects skill
Yeah.
effectiveness of the labor.
Yeah.
And the second component is the hours, the change in the,
Yes.
the number of hours, you've worked at the
Yeah.
aggregate level. Third being, the change in labor force participation. And the
Yeah.
last is, the age distribution, which is the change in size of the working age population relative to, the population as a whole. And
Yeah.
so, sir, obviously gave a lot of, empirical, facts about how they're offsetting each other, both in the US and, in the Europe. So why don't you, Professor, tell us about, your findings?
Yeah,
Um,
so it's that labor force participation and aging are really in some sense kind of the same thing. I mean, there's elements to labor force participation that we could talk about, like women entering the workforce and stuff, which is related. But most of what you find for a place like the US has to do with
mhm,
the demographics, right?
mhm,
Educate, you're absolutely right. So like this is the breakdown here is pretty standard in the growth literature. And
uh-huh,
there's issues with various things. Like the education aspect of it is a really crude measure of education-based skills, which is a kind of a good measure of skills, but misses certain things. So I think, it's a pretty good measure. But what's surprising, I think, is that the aging aspect of it is so relevant, is numerically really matters a lot.
okay,
Uh, and in some sense a surprise to me in the rich countries. And it's so if you think of a a drop in fertility rates,
uh-huh,
then what's happening is the population for a while, right? There's kind of a bonus here because if so imagine if we just stopped having kids completely tomorrow,
uh-huh,
right? Then we wouldn't have a bunch of dependents who didn't work, right?
uh-huh,
We wouldn't have a bunch of small children running around. The population for a while would be dominated by working age people
mhm,
who not only are working age and don't have dependents to take care of, but they can work more because they don't have dependents to take care of. Like we would have a boom in labor force participation. But as they got older, there'd be no one to fill in for them. As they retired or they left the workforce would, as a proportion of the population, would shrink, right? We'd have a bunch of people who were 75 and 80 years old who couldn't work or didn't want to work. And then we'd have very, very few workers, right? So that's the extreme version of what happened in the US. We just had a very distinct drop in fertility around 1970. And so we ended up, for a while, had a very big surge in growth because we had lots of working age people relative to the population, but there wasn't anybody to kind of follow and fill in for them as they started to get older and retire. So the US is just a good example of what happens when fertility falls, and it's a good example because we can see it happen really rapidly.
Okay.
But any country that has falling fertility is experiencing this in some version in one way or the other. It just may be happening a lot slower in other places. So it's happening in South Korea. It happened in South Korea. It just is happening at a somewhat slower pace. China is experiencing this now in a pretty distinct pace because of the distinction of the one-child policy and the drop in fertility. They are now experiencing the same thing. India will ultimately experience this in kind of a much slower way. Because if you look at Indian statistics, right, fertility has declined down to around replacement level, but it's done so over a relatively, it's kind of done that calmly, right? Like it's kind of done that over a couple decades. So the motion of that age distribution it'll evolve for India pretty slow. So it'll involve a drag on growth, but it'll be pretty small relative to what you see in the US or in China.
Yes. And so, so our median age is somewhere around 28, 29. So
right. I think that's
have like 20, 25 years still,
yeah.
left. Whereas other countries.
And the thing is with the slow decline in fertility, it's not even that the median age will grow very slowly, but even more important, I guess this gets picked up by the median, there continues to be generations following those 28-year-olds right now who will continue to fill in the workforce.
Yes.
Right. That's China. It's not only is median age getting up there, but there's at some point it's going to get to the point where there's barely anybody to fill in the workforce. It'll be all retired people for a handful of workers. India is not going to face quite anywhere near as dramatic of a situation, I think, just because the fertility decline was much more, it just took much longer, right? It occurred much more gradually over a couple decades.
Yes. Yeah. And so one point is that, we are a service-driven economy. And China perhaps has not been able to make the transition to service.
Yeah, that's a great distinction to make, right? Which is, and there's a whole interesting literature on kind of this premature deindustrialization, I think is how people refer to it. Countries a little like India, that the traditional move here would be what China did or South Korea did, or a little bit what Vietnam has done, where we kind of have this rapid expansion of manufacturing. We export a bunch of the manufactured goods, and then that kind of declines as we get richer. Whereas India, you guys have kind of skipped the manufacturing aspect of that and replaced it really with kind of service exports. And I think there's an interesting argument, and I don't know that we have a great sense of what the right answer is to this so is there something fundamentally bad, so to speak, for Indian development because you didn't do manufacturing exports? And there's a lot of technology and training and things that kind of comes with learning how to do that. Or is it fine because what is happening in India is that it's an export-led kind of, you kind of are able to sell into the world in order to fund some of the development that you guys want to do. And it so happens in this case that it's service-led. For all the typical stories that people tell about India, that it's because of the large English-speaking population and the high levels of education. I don't think we know the answer. I think I tend to lean towards the side that I don't see why you have to put together iPhones in order to become a developed country, or have a huge textile industry. I don't see any reason why having a large software service industry or
Yeah.
whatever we want to think about isn't just as good
Yes.
for advancing the country. Now,
Yeah.
you may the counter argument would just be maybe there's some missing aspect, kind of learning certain aspects of like
Yeah.
engineering that get
Yeah.
imported, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know. I just don't know how to size that. I don't know how to say whether that's crucial or not.
Yeah. And so I think that I just want you to, spend 2 minutes and talk about if we are going to catch up, with China. We still have a long way to go.
Sure.
So you think what aspect of human capital, we need, looking at, for instance, our labor force participation of women is, one of the lowest
Yeah.
in the world.
I,
Yeah.
I think that, right. So I think that's one aspect. And I think that's true about not just India, but a number of countries that are attempting to make this take off, which is that there is kind of a very obvious low-hanging, easy
Yeah.
easy advance to take, which is to be more open to allowing women's participation in the workforce, and
Yeah.
not just participation in the workforce, but across professions and allowing them into the full range of careers.
Yeah.
There's a whole great paper by Chad Jones and Pete Klenow and Chang Tai-Shea and Eric Hurst
Yeah.
about how this worked in the US and how allowing both in the US, African Americans as well as women to sort into their kind of best possible occupations has a
Yeah.
massive productivity effect, right? Like not having women be able to, just kind of for whatever reasons that women
Yeah.
aren't able to, say, become doctors at the same rate,
Yeah.
throws away a lot of really good doctors. So I think that is maybe one of the, in some sense, the easiest, because you don't necessarily have to, you don't have to spend anything to do that, right? You don't have to build a giant factory to do that. That's something that can be done for relatively cheap. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Professor Vollrath. So, I bring in the other two component of, growth,
Yeah.
which are linked with, physical capital. And if you break that down, so that comes down to two components. One is the contribution of physical capital accumulation, and the other being the contribution of, productivity. So, and now, my reference to you will be mainly, pitting up India against China. Because, we lag China in terms of infrastructure and other physical, capital.
Right.
But, we also have to provide employment to a large, working class, right? As a population officially now, I think they've crossed the, China's. So, sir,
Right.
so what are your thoughts on this, Professor?
Yeah. So,
Yeah. Yes.
right. So I think, so physical capital accumulation is definitively part of kind of advancing to, we'll call it the frontier, reaching relatively rich country status, whether it means living standards are anything close, right? We're kind of like South Korea's, if we could get India and China to South Korean levels of living standards, that would be an amazing miracle, right? That's kind of where we're headed, even if it's not quite equal to, say, Canada, whatever. It's very rich. Everybody's comfortable. So physical capital accumulation is clearly a distinct part of that, right? So, and we've seen it very clearly in China to the point that we discuss whether, in fact, they've done it too much, right?
Yes.
But I think that, so I think the Chinese example is a good one that points to both the benefits and the availability of physical capital accumulation as a driver of growth, but also the limits. So very traditionally, we think about growth and teach growth that physical capital accumulation can drive high rapid growth rates temporarily. And by temporarily, I mean for a couple decades, right? 20 years, maybe 25 years. And that's kind of what we saw in China. That's what we saw in Japan before that. That's what we saw in Germany after World War II. We have a couple decades of very rapid growth that centered around physical capital accumulation, which always kind of comes in part with accumulating kind of technological capabilities, right? It's not just building capital. That capital is being built using the best new technology and Maybe in India it would be something like kind of skipping past certain technologies and going right to like, well, we're going to install giant solar electric farms all over and power our country that way.
Yeah.
Anyway, but physical capital accumulation is a necessary tool for development. And in some sense, it's the easy one, in the sense that we kind of know what to do. Now, it's
Yes.
hard to maybe get politically organized to do it. It's hard to find the financing. It's hard
Yeah.
to decide where to put my train route between these two cities. I have to figure that, but those are engineering problems
Yeah.
often.
Yeah.
Those are solvable with enough smart people, which is, when we think about how China was able to do it, what are you able
Yes.
to do? You're able to throw a lot of smart people at the problem.
Yes.
India has that same advantage, right? Like, so we have this huge pool of very smart people that we can throw at these problems.
Yes.
So the capital accumulation part, I think that is that kind of thing where you say, once you begin that in earnest in
Yes.
India, I think there's reasons to look at India today and say, this is kind of beginning. You see new train lines going in.
Yes.
The Golden Quadrilateral transportation system seems to have started to, come together. If we looked at China 25 years ago, we wouldn't
Yeah.
have said, oh God, look at their infrastructure. It's so
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
They were just getting started. So I think there's reasons to believe India is on the cusp of that as well. So what do you have from that? So we see China's now starting to slow down
Yes.
because at some point you reach the limit of what you
Yes.
can do,
Yes. Yes.
right?
So one distinction is
Yeah,
the nature of the political setup.
right,
China being in an authoritarian regime, so they could do this.
right.
Whereas in India, you need
Yes.
consensus.
Yeah, you have India is more like the US, where you have to kind of fight through all the political layers in order
Yes.
to make things happen, right? And so China definitively kind of had an advantage of being able to top down just say, we're going to do this. Now, but the cost on that, and we could argue about whether it was worth starting earlier and do it and having this issue. So China seemed to be able to start this process earlier. In some sense, as a poorer country, was able to start this.
Yeah.
But they aren't able to stop it, right? Like they're kind of shooting way past the
Yes. Yes.
goal here, right?
Yes. Yes.
They're doing infrastructure projects, I think, that
Yes.
we kind of agree at this point have very little marginal value.
Yes. Yes.
But they keep getting done because they have now this top-down political logic to them
Yes. Yes.
that more divided up, layered political system like India's would run out of political will before
Yes.
they kept going. And they would make mistakes. Like, let's not get ahead of ourselves. India is going to make mistakes on infrastructure and mistakes on capital accumulation. The US did, Britain did, France did, Germany did. Everybody makes these mistakes.
Uh-huh.
And we're stuck with some of them, and we just end up stuck with them at some point. But okay, we're going to have some mistakes, but I think India's maybe started later, but
Yeah.
maybe probably won't get into the situation like China where you kind of overshoot,
Yeah.
right? So there's that trade-off, and again, I don't know what the right version of that trade-off is, like who won on that, but it seems as if India is entering that phase where, okay, we're going to make this big acceleration, leveraging a lot of capital accumulation now because some of that infrastructure is there.
Yeah.
It starts to leapfrog, it starts to accelerate. Now, it's good for a big surge for a while, 15 years, a kind of like noticeable growth that we could be on the cusp of that, which would be really exciting. Then it becomes a question of like, well, okay, how close to that frontier do you end up getting? China seems to be leveling off at this point, kind of well short of, say, South Korean living standards. They're having a hard time taking it all the way up.
Yes. Yeah.
Which may be partly demographic. They have rich country demographics, but they are still kind of middle income.
Yes.
They didn't quite reach the frontier. South Korea got to the frontier and then got the rich country demographics in a big way, right? They're collapsing. The rate will be an issue for them 15 years from now, but China kind of did those two things together. So India may be, in this sense, late to start relative to those examples, but may have a better grouping of
yes,
pointers, right?
yeah,
The population is still young. The
Yes.
fertility rate has fallen, but it's not fallen off a cliff.
Yes.
It's got the political system that finally maybe is able to
Yes.
begin this capital accumulation process, but maybe is smart enough or just not going to have the willingness to go too far.
Yeah.
I would be personally very optimistic about the prospects of India over the next 20 to 30 years in terms of
Yes.
growth,
Yes.
because of those features and because there's a lot of the underlying
Yeah.
things, the very good education system, the high level of technical skills
Yeah.
floating around in the country, and a number of these other, like we said, like a couple of these other kind of like easy
Yes.
things,
Yes.
like expansion of women's ability to work and stuff,
Yes.
which these things have this big positive impact. And again, they don't cost anything. They're kind
Yeah.
of societal changes that take place that you kind of get this bonus out of. So I think relative to where China is now, I would imagine I would be shocked if in 20 years India had not become very close, if not caught up to in living standards to China, if maybe surpassed it. I don't. It seems to me entirely plausible,
Yes.
as something to look at. Yeah,
Yes.
I think
Yeah.
so. Like it kind of all those advantages are lining up.
Yeah. So, yeah, Professor. So that, actually is an excellent note for me to, ask you, my next question, which is more of an anecdotal, empirical, finding. And so it was seen that the first decade of the 21st century was, good for developing countries.
Yeah,
So their economies, expanded at unprecedented rates, resulting in both a large reduction in extreme poverty and expansion of middle class.
yeah,
So this growth was mainly led by efforts of China, India, and small number of other Asian, countries. But it has been seen since the year 2000 that their growth process has slowed down, reflecting a narrowing of the advanced and developing country growth rate differential.
yeah.
So this leads to this argument that they might not be likely to catch up, close the development, gap with richer countries anytime soon. So would you attribute this, sir, to the lack of proper theoretical construct in the two dominant theories that are out there? One
Uh,
Lewis, 1954, and the other, being the solo growth model. Yes, sir.
yeah. So I think there's a role here, right? So I think there is kind of a mental way of thinking about this that you can appeal to Lewis and Solo,
Yeah.
although I'm not sure that would be the whole story, right? So I think there's something about like the Arthur Lewis dual economy story that's very tangible and real. And I think an aspect of it that we don't necessarily account for when we talk kind of broadly about development is that there is I don't know how to say it, like people are sticky in their situations.
Mhm. Yeah.
Right. Like, so if you think about China still has, a couple 100 million people working in rural areas that will
Yes.
probably leave those rural areas.
Yes.
India is going to be very similar, right? There's several 100 million people working in rural areas of India
Yes.
that will probably never leave. And I could build the best infrastructure in the world and I could raise wages to about as high as you want to make them in one of the cities in India. And
Yes.
there are people that will still never leave that rural area. Maybe partially because they don't have the skill to go work in Bangalore,
Uh-huh.
but also just because they don't want to go.
Yeah.
That they're, and it's not just an age thing, but it tends to be an age thing. If I'm 50 years old and I spent my life living in my village and I know how
Yeah.
to run my farm and I have my surroundings and my
Yeah.
social network,
Yeah.
the living standard improvement I might perceive is not going to draw me no matter what, right?
Okay.
And so I think the Lewis model has aspects of it which it looks like there's this big inefficiency, but it's really kind of explained by people just kind of being unwilling to move. So most of those movements, those kind of structural changes that
Yeah.
Lewis is talking about, I think, and he didn't talk specifically, well, he talked a little bit about this, but not kind of very formally. I
Uh-huh.
think that that has a real age aspect to it. Again, a demographic aspect. And so we see those structural changes happen a lot just as kids grow up and they
Yes.
leave, right? Which is my story. I grew up on a farm in Wisconsin and I left.
Yeah.
Kind of late in the structural change process in the US, but that's kind of how that worked. We see that in China, right?
Yeah.
Like people very often don't leave the farm, or the head of the family stays, but many of
Yeah.
the kids go. There's back and forth migration, but a lot of the Lewis kind of concept of that dual economy thing is just aging,
Yeah.
or having those people be able to move. And this is where China's fertility drop helps with that, right? So I'm not trying to find jobs for 5 kids in each family. I'm trying to find jobs for the 1 kid in each
Yeah.
family in this. That's okay. That's easier. This is
Yeah.
where India's fertility drop now, and in rural areas it's falling as well,
Yeah.
become is part of that acceleration, right?
Yeah.
So I think there is that aspect where the Lewis model is part of what we can think about. The solo model is, of course, important. It's basically the model that tells us that capital accumulation can happen really rapidly, can contribute to growth really rapidly, but will ultimately dissipate and slow down because you
Yes.
can't accumulate capital, or you can accumulate capital forever, but it just won't do you any good.
Yes.
Uh, so those two models are very much how I think baseline for how to think about these big macro structural changes in these developing economies. Now, why did we see relative
Yeah.
slow growth in the last few years?
Yeah.
I think some of it is that it's this variance in timing, right? A lot of it depends on how you weight it, but if you just want to, depending on how you weight the data, a lot of it's just China. China grew really fast in the 90s and then it grew
Yeah.
slower. And Chinese growth was very good for several other countries, right? Like who filled in with exporting parts to China or took over from China as China got more expensive.
Yeah.
So as China slows down, that kind of driver is slowed down a little. The
Yeah.
rich countries slow down. So the export markets for the manufactured goods that countries may have used to climb up the ladder slows down a little. And
Yes.
so that not everybody's, everybody's not in a bubble in their own world here.
Yeah.
I think, but I think there's reason to believe that there's no reason to believe that just because that we had a period of 10 years where growth was a little slower kind of overall,
Yeah.
that means it necessarily will forever slow down. There's things like India.
Yeah.
There are other countries that will, as they reach those same conditions that
Yeah.
India certainly seems to have kind of constellation, right?
Yeah.
Will be able to make those same leaps. No, Nigeria at some point will figure it out, and
Yes.
there'll be a surge in growth because Nigeria is massive and will
Yes.
drag a bunch of West Africa with it. So I think we're going to get waves like this where we'll see some catch up and then some slowdown, some catch up and some slowdown, because it's just not, we don't have like we're not talking about a sample of thousands and thousands where law of large numbers means there's always someone having these growth surges. There's only a couple hundred countries and most of them are really tiny.
Yeah.
So it's going to be kind of jumpy, I guess. So I guess I'm not concerned as much about like, oh, will growth slow down a little, or will these countries all ever catch up to the frontier? I
Yeah.
just don't think it's gone on long enough for us to say. We're talking decade and decade long processes, so we
Yeah.
don't quite know. Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing is that we don't know a lot about the structural change process in the developing countries. There's a lot of data for this available on the advanced economies, so you cannot sort of draw parallels. And so there's a paper on this also, published in the year 2013. It was published in a Handbook of Economic Growth.
Yeah.
Growth and
So
structural. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I think we have a little better concept than that of what the pattern has generally looked like. Now, to your point, that doesn't mean that everybody has to follow that pattern.
Yeah.
But there is some, to the extent that we have the data, there's seems to be quite a bit of regularity in terms of kind of these patterns, right? Like there's no such thing as a country that gets rich and still is essentially heavily agricultural. There's
Okay.
nobody has ever done that.
Okay.
And so agriculture becomes a shrinkingly small part of everybody's economy as they get rich.
Yeah.
So we kind of know that doesn't mean that somebody couldn't blow me away tomorrow, and 50 years from now, I would be shocked and about being wrong about this, but I'm fairly confident on this one. Like, there's nobody who's going to become Western European rich, but yet have 90% of their people in farms. So broad senses of these structural changes, I think we do kind of have a good idea.
Yeah.
India, 30 years from now, I guarantee you agriculture will be a smaller fraction of Indian GDP than it is today. I'd be willing to bet you a lot of my money on that.
Yeah.
But to your point, like this question, and I think we already talked about it a little, this
Yeah.
question of do you have to do manufacturing in particular, right? Do you have to put together electronics or make
Yeah.
cars or
Yeah.
a steel mill in order to become rich? I think
Yeah.
that's a bigger open question. And I don't think that the macro data says that the manufacturing sector tends to increase and then decrease as you get rich. So
Yeah.
middle income countries tend to have a high level of manufacturing.
Yeah.
But it's not obvious, but that's a little bit a function of how we decided to classify economic activity. Right? So historically, manufacturing was kind of a big deal in a country like the US. Manufacturing firms also were called manufacturing firms, but they involved lots and lots of pieces, right? Ford Motor
Yes.
Company makes cars, but it had an accounting company inside of it. It had a finance company inside of it. It had basically had an advertising company inside of it, right?
Yes.
It was a giant firm that had all these pieces that all were internal, but we called it a manufacturing firm. So it looked like it was a massive piece of the economy.
Yes.
Today, we kind of have different corporate structures, right? Where if I want to manufacture something, I probably outsource the actual manufacturing of it. Like Apple. Like
Yeah.
Apple, right, is a technology company. They don't make any phones. Foxconn makes the phones.
Yes.
Apple designs the phones, right? So are they a manufacturing company? No, they're a
Yeah.
quote technology company or whatever you want to call it. But they are kind of a manufacturing company. I mean, I'm buying an iPhone, but they
Yes.
aren't classified as a manufacturing company. And a manufacturing company like in China or in India that is putting together, say, a phone or some product for a US firm is a small manufacturing company because all it's doing is doing the manufacturing. It doesn't
Yes.
have the finance and the design and all those other things. So having a small manufacturing sector in, say, India relative to historical norms may not actually mean that the country is behind or is missing something. It just means that in India, the design work and the ad work and the finance work are in multiple firms, outsourced to other companies, but those are all classified as services. So I know it's kind of a weird, convoluted story I'm telling. I'm just saying that, like, kind of the way we classify firms and economic activity may just be part of the story. We may have overstated the importance of manufacturing in rich countries in the past.
Yeah.
And we may be understating the importance of services in poor countries today,
Yeah.
just because of the way we decided to divide stuff up.
Yeah.
No one did this deliberately. It's just kind of how it happened.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
So I guess,
yeah.
I guess I think the structural changes kind of are common across all these countries. I'm less convinced that differences in the data tell us about real differences across the countries.
Yeah. So, when we talk about services, growth, the investment there that sort of matters more is, the investment in human capital and the investment in institutions.
Yeah.
And so it is seen that they are highly correlated with income levels, but they are not a reliable predictor of economic growth. So would you agree with this, Professor? This is
Yeah, so I think this gets to, I mean, we have to be a little careful, right? Like, because there's always that distinction between levels and growth rates, right? So, I think some of what you're kind of getting at is we have a country like India that has very high education levels.
yeah,
Uh, and depending on the dimension we look at,
Yeah.
pretty high functioning institutional quality. And on other dimensions, I'm sure someone would need to tell me, oh my God, no, things are a disaster on certain levels, right?
Yeah.
Institutions are weird, right? It's hard to
Yeah.
measure these things.
Yeah.
But so it doesn't necessarily mean, and South Korea was kind of the same. It was very highly educated, but very poor
Yes.
back in the 50s and 60s. Okay, so just having a high education doesn't mean you're going to be rich. We know that, right? Because we have counterexamples.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean that it's not necessary for the high growth to happen, right? So it's very hard to find a counterexample where you show me a country that has very low education rates and yet
Yeah.
grew very quickly and reached rich country status, right? So
China, to some extent.
to some extent, except you look and I think numbers matter here, right?
Yeah.
And this is where China and that was where India benefits as well, which is it's not necessarily clear that you need, like, I don't necessarily need a high percent of my population to say have engineering degrees in order to have a really robust engineering sector to do all my infrastructure work. I
Yeah.
do need critical mass. I do need a critical number of
Yeah.
engineers,
Yeah.
right? And so if you're China or India, even if the percentage is relatively low,
Yeah.
right? The numbers are just so massive
Yes.
that I can have tens of thousands of really competent engineers, even if a very low percentage of my population has an engineering degree. So I think China benefited in some sense that way. They decided to just concentrate and invest in a very tight core
Yeah.
of the capital. But I think even if historically you look backwards at rich countries, I think there's interesting economic history that would tell you that it wasn't even the average education that was important. It was that they were able to get, and they kind of maybe accidentally did this, get
Yeah.
concentrated cores of engineers and people together. And it maybe in some countries we do it by having really broad-based education and kind of looking for the best people and hoping that they rise to the top.
Yeah.
Whereas maybe in different settings, we just kind of try and identify people early and we just educate the crap out of them and ignore
Yeah.
everybody else.
Yeah.
Both are ways to getting to us to a core set of really competent technical people,
Yeah.
which I think is probably what we need
Yeah.
to generate the growth. And
Yeah.
so you see instances like Korea with high average education, but they weren't growing yet.
Yeah.
I think it's easy to argue that they hadn't grown yet, but that high education level gave them that core competency so that when they were able to kind of get started, they had what they needed, right?
Yeah.
I don't need everybody to have a master's in mechanical engineering, but I
Yeah.
have to have enough mechanical engineers around
Yes.
to make,
Yes.
right? So this is a really long-winded way of answering that, but I think I think that's kind of a necessary condition, but it's clearly not a sufficient condition is to have high education in order to grow.
Yeah. And one area where technology sort of is making, a big difference is, the gig economy. Would you agree with this?
I mean, it is, but I mean, in the scope of kind of like long run economic development, I don't know. Well, I don't know that we know enough about it or that it's been around enough to really say that it's done anything or would be an important difference, right? It's definitely changed, certainly in rich countries, it's changed the nature of work, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's a coherent argument to make that it could allow, right? So you could take some place like India and say, this is one of these technologies that allows us to skip
Yes.
past certain stages of, in the same way that countries can skip past having landline phones and move to having mobile phones, right?
Yes.
Well, why would you install this old technology? Then it's kind of like, well, why would you necessarily force everybody to work for a large firm, right?
Yeah.
So like the Ford example I gave, why would you force all the firms to be these gigantic have all the functions inside of them things? Why don't we specialize more? Specialization that could actually be more efficient. So I think there's a coherent argument to make that technology allowing not just for kind of gig economy, but for separation and specialization could be
Yeah.
very good, right? And so that may be something that a place like India can take advantage of
Yes.
that a US or a France or the UK, we didn't have the technology. We had to kind of organize internally in big firms to keep track of everything because we didn't have the technology to kind of
Yeah.
break everything up and specialize.
Yeah.
So I think that's a valid argument. I just don't know how much of an impact it would have.
Yes.
But I think there's a coherent argument to make there. Yeah.
Yeah. We can take advantage of that.
Yeah. So
Technology.
to the extent, exactly, to the extent that there are advantages to it, you guys can jump right to those advantages
Yes.
and you don't have to sacrifice some existing system to get there. You're like, oh, we'll just take advantage of this. Great. Right. And that's in some sense one of that kind of very classic Gershon Kron advantage of backwardness, kind of a terrible term, but the advantage of getting to skip over steps
Yes.
and
Yes.
skip kind of bad technologies or dated technologies, right?
Yeah.
Like we do a lot. If you visit Western Europe or you visit the US, you see that a lot of what we do is retrofitting new technologies into our old technologies.
Okay.
Which is great. Like we have the ability to do that, but
Yeah.
we do a lot of retrofitting.
Yeah.
So there's something positive about being able to just put in the best version of the new technology and start with that as your base.
Yeah.
That can be an advantage for a place like India
Yeah.
to go forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, sir. So I have actually one funny question,
Sure.
which I would like you to give your thoughts. And so most of the discussion regarding growth are actually very technical, and you sort of is making it more accessible through your blog, by giving us a very simplistic version of how it sort of matters.
Yeah.
So, and I think this sort of is important because the general population needs to know, because the media might say slow growth is bad, but it actually isn't, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yes. I kind of know what you're talking about. I
yeah.
have there's similar feeling.
So
Yeah.
how can we get across the technical knowledge
Yeah.
in a simplistic way, to people who need to know all this? Yeah.
Yeah, this is something obviously I think about, right? It's like this, how do we tell stories
Yeah.
about economic growth so that they make sense to right? You said your average person, right?
Yeah.
Who's not gonna sit and think technically about this at
Yeah.
all. And then some of it's just being able to tell stories, right? Like I think it's important and to think hard about what are easy analogies to wrap your head around for
Yeah.
people to explain things about growth. So one example I use in class a lot, so just to get people to get their head around things, is to think about capital accumulation in the solo model, right? I teach that in class, I get the math, we can draw diagrams, but how do you get the intuition that, well, capital accumulation can give you a surge in growth. You can benefit a lot from it, but eventually it kind of runs out.
Yeah.
And I usually use the example of it's a little like gaining weight,
Yeah.
right? So if you have a child, right, they eat a lot and they grow really fast,
Yeah.
but eventually they stop growing. And
Yeah.
that's not bad.
Yeah.
That's just an example of the process kind of working, right? Like
Yeah.
that, them
Yes.
accumulating the capital of their
Yes.
body.
Yes.
And the institutions and certain things are kind of like the genetics that dictate how tall you're going to be, right? So we
Yeah.
kind of, there's differences across people and
Yeah.
they all grow. But that nature of that process and I think people kind of can get their head around. I'm like, yeah, when you're a little kid, you eat and you gain a lot, in percent terms, you gain a lot every year, right? Like if you're a baby, you're supposed to get like, I can't remember the numbers, the markers when we had our kids, like it's supposed to get like a 50% gain in weight in 6 months or something. It's considered
Yeah.
healthy. Like that's insane, right? Like
Yeah.
if I gained 50% of my weight in 6 months,
Yeah.
I'd probably be dead, right? Like this would be
Yeah.
ridiculous.
Yeah.
Doctor would be freaking out.
Yeah.
So people can wrap their head around stories like that, but we as economists,
Yeah.
I think do a great job of
Yeah.
coming up with these basic stories to explain things like, well, what is growth actually doing, or how does it work?
Yeah.
People don't even get the idea of how to count
Yeah.
GDP, what
Yeah.
it means. So one of the reasons to go all the way back to the beginning of our talk, right? One of
Yeah.
the reasons I admire a lot Chad Jones and Paul Romer is that
Yeah.
I think they do stop and think hard about how to explain
Yeah.
with stories how to explain what's happening.
Yeah.
And like so Chad, for instance, writes these incredibly technically complicated things that, it's really hard to get your head around what's going on in the math sometimes, but he's always got a story for you
Yeah.
that kind of explains what the core idea is. And it's super helpful, even for me, like I rely on those a lot. Like
Yeah.
I need the story in order to, oh, this is why the math is interesting. This is why the math shows me that it works and everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the fact that you're doing this, I think these are great. Like people
Yeah.
kind of just to understand a little more about, or I think if they understood a little more that growth was just like, look, there's nothing moral about it. It's just the process of accumulation
Yeah.
of more goods and services, getting a little better every year at doing what
Yeah.
a little more infrastructure. That's all we're talking about.
Yeah.
There's a lot of political and moral baggage laid on top of it, but we don't. That's different kinds of discussions about distribution and fairness.
Yeah.
But we have to throw away growth to talk
Yeah.
about those things. Growth makes those things easier to talk about, makes it easier to deal with.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's not straightforward. I think as economists in general, we need to spend more time telling simple stories and less time writing down complicated math.
Yeah, and your book sort of, does an excellent job. I actually enjoyed reading it, and I would
Thank
encourage
you.
all my
Yeah.
listeners
Yeah,
to.
I mean, this is kind of, it's part of, that's very heartening to hear, because one of the goals of it is to try and express things in ways that it would be way more broad, that people could appreciate what was going on, and yet still give the background, right? So that if you wanted to know some of the details, you could find them and could understand where they came from. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would encourage all my listeners to, go read this book if you are seriously curious about getting to know more about, the economic growth process. Yeah, on that note, sir, thank you so much. I
Absolutely. Yeah, this is great. Thank you.
thoroughly enjoy, the conversation, especially the reference and the distinction you made in terms of, the components of growth and how that sort of would differ in the emerging market, India and China.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like I said, India is a fascinating story, and I'm kind of excited to see how it goes over the next 20 to 30 years, because I think it'll be a really pretty amazing transformation. But no, and thank you for doing the podcast and asking these kinds of questions. I mean, this is fun to talk about, but I think you're, this last part 100% right, that being able to express this to a larger group of people is a real key.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you
Very
so much.
appreciate it. All right, awesome. Wonderful to talk. And great. So yeah, keep me posted on the podcast. I'll be listening in the future.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Vollrath. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Bye.